Hey there, restless souls. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowy corners of medieval minds, where logic took a backseat to fear and superstition ruled every waking moment. We're talking about the strange, bizarre, and downright ridiculous beliefs that kept our ancestors awake at night, terrified of everything from their own shadows to the neighbor's cat. So, before you settle in for what might be the most peculiar bedtime story you've ever heard, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these deep dives into history's oddities. And if you're new here, welcome to a place where we explore the forgotten corners of the past, one strange tale at a time. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are, because there's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all gathered here together, no matter where in the world you might be. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to a time when the world was full of monsters, magic, and beliefs so strange they'd make your modern anxieties seem perfectly reasonable by comparison. Picture this. You're living in medieval Europe sometime around the 13th century. The sun has just set, casting long shadows across your small village, but you're not admiring the twilight. You're barricading your door, checking every corner of your home, and muttering prayers under your breath. Because in your world, darkness doesn't just bring night, it brings danger of the supernatural kind. You see, medieval people didn't just believe in superstitions, they lived them, breathed them, organized their entire existence around them. These weren't quaint little customs passed down through generations. These were survival strategies in a world where the line between reality and nightmare was thinner than parchment. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Medieval people were absolutely terrified of their own reflections, not because they were vain or insecure, but because they genuinely believed that mirrors could steal your soul. Think about that for a moment. Every time you caught a glimpse of yourself in still water or polished metal, you risked losing a piece of your very essence. This wasn't just paranoia, there was a whole elaborate belief system built around it. They thought that when you looked into a mirror, you were actually seeing into another realm, a shadow world where demons and spirits lurked, and if you stared too long, or if your reflection somehow became distorted, those creatures could reach through and snatch your soul right out of your body. Barbers, who often doubled as surgeons and dentists, had to be incredibly careful with their polished metal tools. They'd perform elaborate rituals before using anything reflective, blessing the instruments, and sometimes covering them with cloth between uses. Imagine going in for a simple haircut and having to worry about demonic possession through the looking glass. But mirrors were just the beginning. Medieval people had developed an intricate catalog of supernatural threats that would make modern horror movies seem like children's bedtime stories. Take, for instance, their relationship with everyday animals. You might think a black cat crossing your path is unlucky, but medieval folks took animal superstitions to extraordinary lengths. Dogs that howled at night weren't just being noisy, they were warning of impending death, communicating with spirits, or possibly revealing that someone in the village was practicing witchcraft. A dog that refused to enter a house meant the building was cursed. A dog that suddenly stopped barking meant danger was approaching, something so evil that even the animals fell silent in fear. Roosters held special significance because they were believed to have the power to banish demons with their crow. That's why you'll find roosters prominently featured on medieval church weather vanes. They weren't just decorative, they were spiritual guardians, protecting the sacred space from evil forces that might try to infiltrate during the vulnerable hours of dawn. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval superstitions was how they turned ordinary, everyday activities into potential death traps. Something as simple as sneezing became a life or death situation. Medieval people believed that when you sneezed, your soul temporarily left your body, creating a perfect opportunity for demons to slip in and take possession. That's why saying "God bless you" after someone sneezed wasn't just politeness, it was emergency spiritual first aid. The blessing would protect the temporarily vacant body and ensure the soul found its way back safely. People would actually panic if someone sneezed and nobody immediately offered a blessing. They'd scramble over each other to provide protection, sometimes multiple people shouting blessings simultaneously just to be absolutely certain. Imagine living in a world where a simple bodily function could literally damn your eternal soul. Every sniffle, every unexpected sneeze in church or at the market became a moment of genuine terror for everyone within earshot. And speaking of bodily functions, medieval people had developed elaborate superstitions around something even more basic than sneezing, yawning. They believed that yawning created an opening in your body that evil spirits could use as an entrance. Picture sitting in a boring sermon or working in the fields on a hot afternoon, fighting the urge to yawn because you're genuinely afraid that demons might crawl into your mouth. The solution was to make the sign of the cross over your mouth immediately after yawning, or to say a quick prayer to seal the spiritual opening. Some people would even cover their mouths with both hands while yawning, not out of politeness, but out of genuine fear for their immortal souls. But medieval superstitions weren't limited to protecting yourself from evil. They also included elaborate rituals for attracting good fortune, and these could be just as bizarre as the protective measures. Take, for example, their beliefs about bread. Fresh bread wasn't just food, it was a spiritual entity with its own magical properties. When baking bread, medieval women would make the sign of the cross over the dough before putting it in the oven. They believed this would prevent the devil from spoiling the bread or hiding inside the loaf. But here's where it gets really interesting. They also believed that if you turned a loaf of bread upside down, you would bring terrible luck, not just to yourself, but to your entire household. This wasn't just about wasting food. In their minds, inverting bread was like inverting the natural order of things, creating spiritual chaos that could manifest as illness, crop failure, or even death. Bakers would sometimes refuse to sell bread to customers they suspected might not treat it with proper respect. The superstitions around food extended far beyond bread. Salt, that most common of seasonings, was considered so magically powerful that spilling it was essentially declaring war on the forces of good luck. The only way to counteract spilled salt was to immediately throw a pinch over your left shoulder, because that's where the devil was believed to lurk, waiting for opportunities to cause mischief. Medieval dinner tables were minefields of potential supernatural disasters. Spill the salt, and you've invited evil into your home. Drop a knife, and you've predicted the arrival of a male visitor. Drop a fork, well, forks weren't really a thing yet, but if they had been, dropping one would probably have meant something equally ominous. But perhaps the most elaborate superstitions centered around sleep itself. Medieval people believed that sleep was a time when your soul was most vulnerable, when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds became dangerously thin. They developed intricate bedtime rituals designed to protect themselves through the long, dark hours of night. Before lying down, they would bless their beds, sometimes sprinkling them with holy water or placing blessed objects under the pillows. They believed that demons and evil spirits were most active during the darkest hours, prowling through villages and homes, looking for unprotected souls to torment or possess. Some people would sleep with iron objects under their beds, because iron was thought to repel supernatural creatures. Others would recite specific prayers or psalms, creating a spiritual barrier around their sleeping space. The most superstitious would even arrange their bedding in particular patterns, believing that certain configurations offered better protection against nighttime visitations. And if you happened to wake up in the middle of the night, that was potentially even more dangerous than sleeping peacefully through till dawn. Medieval people believed that if you woke suddenly without apparent cause, it meant something supernatural was nearby, trying to communicate with you, or perhaps preparing to attack. The recommended response was to stay perfectly still, keep your eyes closed, and begin reciting prayers silently in your head until whatever presence had disturbed your sleep moved on. Opening your eyes or moving around would only attract more attention from the spiritual realm, potentially turning a minor supernatural encounter into a full-scale demonic assault. But sleep superstitions went even deeper than bedtime protection rituals. Medieval people had developed an entire science around the meaning of dreams, and it was far more complex than anything you'd find in a modern dream interpretation book. Dreams weren't just random brain activity during sleep, they were messages, warnings, prophecies, and sometimes direct communications from the dead. If you dreamed of water, it meant tears were coming. If you dreamed of bread, abundance was on the way. But if you dreamed of teeth falling out, someone close to you was going to die. These weren't casual interpretations. People would wake up from certain dreams and immediately begin preparing for disaster, changing their plans, warning their families, or seeking protection from the local priest. The most feared dreams were those involving the dead. If a deceased relative appeared in your sleep, it usually meant they had unfinished business or were trying to warn you about some impending danger. But here's the terrifying part. Medieval people believed that if you spoke to the dead person in your dream, if you actually held a conversation with them, they could pull your soul back with them to the afterlife. So if your dead grandmother showed up in a dream trying to tell you something important, you had to resist the urge to ask questions or respond. You had to remain silent, let them deliver their message, and hope they would leave peacefully. People would sometimes wake up screaming because they'd accidentally spoken to a dead relative in their sleep, convinced they'd just sealed their own doom. The fear of death-related dreams was so intense that some people would try to stay awake for days at a time if they'd recently lost a family member. They'd drink bitter herbs, pinch themselves, or even tie strings around their fingers that would cut off circulation and wake them if they started to doze off. better to face exhaustion than risk a conversation with the dead. Medieval superstitions also extended into the realm of everyday objects, turning household items into potential supernatural hazards. Knives, for instance, weren't just tools for cutting food, they were spiritual weapons that required careful handling to avoid attracting malevolent forces. A knife left lying on a table with its blade pointing toward the door meant that evil spirits could use it as a pathway into your home. The blade had to always point inward, toward the center of the room, creating a barrier rather than an invitation. If someone accidentally left a knife pointing the wrong direction, the entire household would need to be spiritually cleansed with prayers and holy water. Scissors were even more dangerous because they could cut spiritual threads as well as physical ones. Medieval people believed that every person was connected to their fate, their family, and their god by invisible threads. If scissors were left open overnight, they might accidentally sever these connections, causing anything from bad luck to complete spiritual isolation. Some households would actually wrap their scissors in cloth every evening, not just to protect the blades, but to prevent them from cutting things that shouldn't be cut. Imagine having to tuck your scissors into bed every night like a dangerous pet that might cause chaos if left unsupervised. Candles presented their own supernatural challenges. The flame of a candle wasn't just providing light, it was a beacon that could attract both good and evil spirits. If a candle flame flickered without any apparent cause, it meant spirits were nearby. If it suddenly went out, something evil had entered the room. If it burned with an unusual color, it was receiving messages from the other world. Medieval people would spend entire evenings watching their candle flames like spiritual weather vanes, interpreting every flicker and dance as a sign of supernatural activity. A candle that burned too brightly meant good fortune was coming. One that burned dimly meant danger was approaching. And if a candle somehow managed to relight itself after being blown out, that was a clear sign that the dead were trying to communicate. The wax drippings from candles were red like tea leaves, with different patterns predicting different futures. Long drips meant a journey was coming. Circular drips meant money was on the way. But if the wax formed the shape of a coffin or a cross, someone in the household was marked for death. Churches took candle superstitions so seriously that they developed elaborate protocols for handling the holy candles used during services. These weren't just religious objects. They were spiritual weapons in the ongoing battle between good and evil, and they had to be treated with the respect due to divine armaments. Even the most mundane household activities became fraught with supernatural significance. Sweeping the floor, for instance, wasn't just about cleanliness. Medieval people believed that how and when you swept could determine the spiritual cleanliness of your home. You never swept toward the door, because that would sweep good luck out of the house. You always swept toward the center of the room, gathering both physical dirt and spiritual negativity into a pile that could then be safely disposed of. And you never, ever swept after sunset, because nighttime sweeping would disturb the spirits that were settling in for the evening. Some people would actually apologize to their homes before sweeping, asking forgiveness from any benevolent spirits that might be resting in the corners or under furniture. The dust and debris weren't just cleaned up and thrown away, they were often buried in the garden or burned in the fireplace, ensuring that any negative energy trapped in the dirt would be properly neutralized. The timing of household chores carried enormous spiritual weight. Washing clothes on a Sunday would bring 7 years of bad luck. Mending clothes after dark would stitch sorrow into the fabric. Even hanging laundry required careful consideration of wind direction, moon phases, and the spiritual condition of the clothesline itself. Medieval women would sometimes spend more time planning the supernatural aspects of their household tasks than actually performing them. They had to consider not just the practical requirements of cooking, cleaning, and mending, but also the complex spiritual implications of every action they took within their homes. This constant vigilance against supernatural threats created a society where people lived in a state of perpetual spiritual alertness. Every sound, every shadow, every unexpected event was potentially a sign from the other world. Life wasn't just about surviving disease, war, and poverty. It was about navigating an invisible landscape of supernatural dangers that could strike at any moment without warning. And it wasn't just about individual survival. Medieval communities developed collective superstitions that bound entire villages together in shared fear and ritual. Take, for example, their beliefs about crossroads. These weren't just intersections where paths met. They were spiritual vortexes where the boundaries between worlds grew thin and dangerous. Medieval people believed that crossroads were gathering places for witches, demons, and restless spirits. That's why they became the traditional sites for executing criminals and burying suicides. The logic was twisted but consistent. If these places were already spiritually contaminated, why not use them to dispose of society's most dangerous elements? But crossroads weren't just dumping grounds for the unwanted dead, they were also places of power where desperate people would go to make bargains with supernatural forces. If you needed to cure a loved one's illness, find a lost object, or change your fortune, you might venture to the nearest crossroads at midnight with an offering. The rituals were elaborate and terrifying. You had to arrive alone, carrying something valuable to trade. Then you had to call out to whatever spirits inhabited that particular intersection, stating your request clearly and offering your payment. But here's the catch. You never knew what might answer your call, and once you'd made contact with the supernatural realm, there was no guarantee you'd be allowed to leave unchanged. Some people would stand at crossroads for hours, waiting for a sign that their bargain had been accepted. Others would flee the moment they heard unexplained sounds or saw shadows moving without apparent cause. And those brave or foolish enough to complete their supernatural transactions often found that the price demanded was far higher than anything they'd been prepared to pay. Villages would sometimes post warnings near dangerous crossroads, not official signs, but subtle markers that locals would recognize. A pile of stones arranged in a particular pattern or branches tied together in a specific way, indicating that something evil had been active in that location recently. Children were strictly forbidden from playing near crossroads, and adults would take long detours to avoid walking through them unnecessarily. Even traveling merchants, who dealt with crossroads constantly in their journeys between towns, would carry special protective amulets and mutter protective prayers every time they had to pass through one. The fear of crossroads was so intense that some communities would actually relocate their villages if too many unexplained deaths or misfortunes occurred near a particular intersection. They'd pack up their entire lives and move to what they hoped would be spiritually safer ground, abandoning homes and fields rather than continue living in proximity to supernatural danger. But crossroads were just one type of location that medieval people approached with supernatural caution. Bridges held their own catalog of terrors. These weren't just engineering marvels that allowed people to cross rivers and ravines. They were spiritual gauntlets where travelers had to negotiate passage with otherworldly guardians. Medieval bridges were believed to be inhabited by bridge spirits, supernatural entities that demanded payment or tribute from anyone attempting to cross. Some of these spirits were merely mischievous, content to accept a coin or a bit of food in exchange for safe passage. But others were actively malevolent, seeking to trap unwary travelers in underwater realms or drag them down to watery graves. The most dangerous bridges were those that had been built over sites where people had drowned or died violently. These structures were thought to be magnets for vengeful spirits, ghostly presences that would try to add new victims to their underwater collections. Crossing such a bridge required elaborate protective rituals, prayers, blessed objects, and sometimes the accompaniment of a priest or holy person. Some bridges became so notorious for supernatural activity that travelers would go dozens of miles out of their way to avoid them. Local communities would sometimes abandon perfectly functional bridges if too many people reported strange encounters or unexplained accidents while crossing them. The construction of new bridges was itself a supernatural undertaking. Medieval builders would often sacrifice animals during the construction process, burying their bodies in the bridge foundations to appease whatever spirits might object to the structure. Some bridges were even rumored to require human sacrifice, though these claims were usually whispered rather than openly acknowledged. Bridge builders were considered to be practicing a form of magic, negotiating with supernatural forces to create structures that could span not just physical spaces, but spiritual boundaries as well. They were respected and feared in equal measure, valued for their skills, but suspected of making deals with powers that ordinary people preferred not to think about. Even after a bridge was completed and blessed by religious authorities, it remained a place of spiritual caution. People would cross themselves before stepping onto the structure, recite protective prayers while walking across, and make small offerings of thanks once they reached the other side safely. Medieval superstitions also extended to the weather, transforming natural phenomena into supernatural communications. Thunder wasn't just the sound of air being displaced by lightning. It was the voice of God expressing displeasure, or demons bowling in the heavens, or the souls of the damned being dragged across the sky in chains. Different types of thunder carried different meanings. A single, sharp crack meant divine judgment was coming. Rolling, continuous thunder meant supernatural armies were battling overhead, and thunder that seemed to echo from underground meant the dead were restless and might soon rise from their graves. Lightning was even more ominous. A lightning strike wasn't just a random electrical discharge, it was a targeted supernatural attack, either divine punishment for secret sins or demonic assault on the innocent. Trees struck by lightning became cursed objects that had to be avoided or destroyed. Buildings hit by lightning were considered spiritually contaminated and often abandoned, but lightning could also be protective. Medieval people believed that lightning never struck the same place twice, so areas that had been hit were considered safe from future supernatural attacks. Some communities would actually build their churches and important buildings on sites where lightning had previously struck, treating the electrical scarring like a form of divine blessing. Rain carried its own supernatural significance. Gentle rain was considered a blessing, a sign that heaven was pleased with the community's spiritual condition. But heavy rain, especially rain that fell without warning or continued for unusually long periods, was seen as divine displeasure or demonic interference with the natural order. The most feared weather phenomenon was rain that fell while the sun was shining. This was called the devil's rain, and it was believed to be a sign that supernatural forces were at war in the heavens. People would flee indoors during such events, convinced that being caught in devil's rain would mark them for demonic attention. Snow presented its own challenges. While fresh snow was generally considered pure and protective, snow that fell in unusual patterns or at unexpected times was viewed with deep suspicion. Snowflakes that seemed to fall upward instead of down meant spirits were ascending from hell. Snow that melted in strange patterns revealed hidden messages from the other world. Medieval people would actually study the patterns left by melting snow, reading them like supernatural newspapers. A patch of snow that melted in the shape of a cross meant divine protection. Snow that melted to reveal the outline of an animal meant that particular creature's spirit was trying to communicate, and snow that melted to show what looked like human figures meant the dead were walking among the living. Wind was perhaps the most supernatural of all weather phenomena. Medieval people believed that different winds carried different spiritual influences. A wind from the east brought divine blessings. A wind from the west carried messages from the dead. A wind from the north brought evil influences, and a wind from the south carried both healing and corruption in equal measure. The sound of wind was interpreted as supernatural communication. Gentle breezes whispered secrets and prophecies, howling winds carried the voices of the damned, and sudden gusts that seemed to come from nowhere were believed to be caused by invisible spirits rushing past on urgent, otherworldly business. People would actually change their behavior based on wind direction. They wouldn't make important decisions during north winds, fearing demonic influence on their judgment. They'd postpone journeys during west winds, believing the dead might try to mislead travelers, and they'd consider proposals and new ventures only during east winds, when divine blessing was most likely. Windows and doors had to be carefully managed during supernatural weather. Opening them during the wrong type of wind could invite evil spirits into your home, but keeping them closed during protective winds could shut out divine blessings. Medieval households developed elaborate protocols for window management, with different family members responsible for monitoring wind direction and adjusting the home's spiritual permeability accordingly. The intersection of weather superstitions with daily life created a complex system where people had to constantly balance practical needs against supernatural concerns. Farmers had to consider not just soil conditions and season timing, but also the spiritual implications of planting during different types of weather. Merchants had to factor supernatural weather patterns into their travel plans, and ordinary families had to arrange their daily activities around the cosmic communications flowing through every breeze and raindrop. This constant attention to supernatural weather patterns meant that medieval people lived in a world where the sky itself was a source of ongoing anxiety and wonder. Every cloud formation carried potential messages. Every change in wind direction required spiritual recalibration, and every storm was a reminder that forces beyond human understanding were actively shaping the world around them. The cumulative effect of all these interlocking superstitions was a society where people existed in a state of perpetual supernatural awareness. They couldn't just walk down a street, cross a bridge, or sleep in their beds without considering the complex spiritual implications of their actions. Every moment of every day required careful navigation through an invisible landscape of supernatural threats and opportunities, and yet, paradoxically, these elaborate superstitions provided a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. By following the proper rituals, making the correct offerings, and maintaining constant vigilance against supernatural dangers, medieval people believed they could influence their fate and protect themselves from the worst that the other world might have in store. The superstitions weren't just fears, they were technologies, complex systems for managing the unknown and unpredictable aspects of existence. In a world where death could come without warning, where disease struck randomly, and where the powerful could destroy the powerless on a whim, supernatural beliefs offered the comforting illusion that careful attention to spiritual details could make the difference between survival and destruction. But as we'll discover, some of the most elaborate medieval superstitions centered around the human body itself. transforming every biological function into a potential supernatural event. The medieval understanding of anatomy wasn't based on scientific observation, but on spiritual interpretation, creating a world where your own flesh and blood could betray you to forces beyond the grave.